Hi, everyone. Looks like there are quite a few people signing on. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Currently, all audio lines are muted and we'll begin here in about a minute or so as folks are logging on. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to use the chat box. You can also use that as a feature to let us know where you're from and to also communicate with the group throughout the webinar. Hello and welcome everyone to the Meeting Match Requirements during COVID-19 Pandemic webinar. We're so glad that you're here with us today. Please use the chat box in the online meeting to let us know where you are from and to communicate with the group. I already see a few hellos coming in. Feel free to use this chat feature to communicate with the presenters and participants throughout the meeting. So to begin, we'll start with a few housekeeping items. During the webinar today, you will be seeing and hearing from me, Lauren Smiley, as well as our presenters who are joining us via video. You'll also see our presentation slides that we prepared for today. All of our other lines are muted. So this session today is being recorded. Live captioning is offered during this session. To enable it, select closed caption on the bottom of your screen in the bottom menu bar. You will see the live captioning after selecting closed caption. Regarding audio, you're probably listening through your computer or a laptop audio. There's also a phone number if you're having any audio issues. This number and webinar ID number are in the chat box if you need to find it or refer back to it during the discussion today. So to start, we invite you to take a few seconds to complete the poll questions to tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization. I want to thank you in advance for your input. So you should be seeing the poll questions coming up on your screen now. So please just take the next 30 seconds to answer those questions, and we thank you again for your input. So while you're filling out the poll, I'll describe our format that we have prepared for the webinar today. Our format today is going to be a series of speakers followed by question and answer. You may submit a question at any time during today's discussion through the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of the page. The answers will be, the questions will be answered at the end of the meeting. After this webinar, we will email you a handout with the FAQs, and also it will include the information that we covered today. If you have any logistical or meeting-related questions, please type them in the chat box so that we can respond to them. And again, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask the presenters, you can use the Q&A feature for that, and we'll get those answered when we reach to that point in today's discussion. Now, I'm pleased to turn the time over to Kristen Weschler with the Office for Victims of Crime. Her opening remarks will be immediately followed by our first speaker, Susan Williams. So Kristen, over to you.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can you give me a thumbs up, Lauren, that you can hear me and see me? Good, all right. Thank you, everyone, as we get used to this new technological connection with all of you. So I want to thank you for joining us on this call. We're very excited and want to let you know that we know that there's a lot of questions on your mind these days. How to provide quality services to your clients in a remote environment, obtaining or maintaining the technology to support your organization's work remotely, how to make up for the economic impacts on your organization, and so on. We're all in this together, and know there's a lot that we're juggling and having to maneuver. So we recognize the broad spectrum of challenges and questions you are facing in this unprecedented time, and hope that our conversation will provide you with clear, helpful answers about how to meet your federal match requirements in this remote environment. We also want to thank you for communicating your challenges with meeting match to OVC. We've heard through those of you who are grantees who have communicated that to us as a grant manager, which I am one, or at different conference or events. We're hoping that through our speakers today, we'll be able to offer you practical new ideas to consider meeting your federal match. Our goal is to help you think outside the box while fully adhering to your federal requirements. Our panel of speakers today includes folks at both the federal and in the field. Our hope is that this diverse panel of experts will clearly and accurately address your questions. We appreciate your time, and more importantly, we appreciate the work that you do every single day to assist and support victims of crime across this country. Thank you. So now I'd like to turn it over to Susan Williams to give a brief overview of the current federal match laws and regulations. Take it away, Susan.
Thank you, Kristen, and good afternoon, everyone. As Kristen said, my name is Susan Williams, and I've actually spent many years working at the Department of Justice, although I'm no longer there. But while I was there, I worked in the three main grant-making agencies, the COPS Office, the Office on Violence Against Women, and OJP's Office for Victims of Crime. And during that time, had the opportunity to work with a number of grant programs that included a federal match requirement. And so the guidelines for meeting these requirements, which we're discussing today, are outlined in the Department of Justice Financial Guide under post-award requirements. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, you can find more information there after this webinar today. But I also just wanted to mention that while our primary focus today is on OVC's Human Trafficking Discretionary Grant Program Match, the requirements that we're talking about really are largely consistent across DOJ grant programs that do require match. So to start with, what is a match? Well, a match for a federal grant is a non-federal share of the total project cost that a grantee is required to contribute to achieve the purposes of an award. So what does that mean? So let's say, for an example, there is a 25% match on a $100,000 human trafficking grant project. So how would that play out? In that instance, there would be a $70,000 award that a recipient would receive from OVC, and then they would have the responsibility of providing and coming up with $25,000 as a match. And that match can be a cash match or an in-kind match. And this is something, again, that is a requirement under the majority of the human trafficking discretionary programs. And it's it's a requirement under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, so it's a statutory requirement. And OVC does not have the discretion of waiving the match. I know in some other instances, in some other programs and agencies, they can consider a waiver for undue hardships, but that's not the case in terms of the OVC's human trafficking grants. So there are two different kinds of match. There is a cash match and an in-kind match. And I'm going to go into each of them a little bit more in detail, but one of the things that I felt like it was very important to note from the start is that the source of matching funds under OVC's human trafficking grant programs may not come from any other federal funding sources. That's generally the rule. I will say there is one new late-breaking exception, and that is that what we're learning is that the Paycheck Protect loans that are coming from the CARES Act actually could be allowable as a cash match in this instance. But again, that would be the only exception. One other broader exception doesn't apply to human trafficking grantees, but I know that there might be others on listening in, is that under some other federal grant programs that have a matching requirement, in some instances, tribes may be able to use federal funds to receive, that they receive under the self-determination contract as match under some other federal programs, again, but it's not something that's applicable here. Also, a couple of other things to keep in mind as we're talking about sources of match is that the source cannot be funding that's included as part of any other federal award match. So if you already have in-kind contributions or cash that's dedicated somewhere else, it cannot be used for this purpose. It also has to be used in support activities that are allowable under the grant program and generally consistent with federal government cost principles. And very importantly, the match must be included in an approved budget that's submitted to OVC. And ultimately, the match must be compliant with other federal provisions on how to determine the contribution value when it comes to an in-kind contribution, but I'll talk a little bit about that more. So if we could go to the next slide. So first I want to talk about cash match. And again, this seems to be a little more straightforward, but it simply is a cash contribution of the amount that is required under the grant. And it's considered a hard match, and it can come from a variety of different sources. Sometimes it's the grantee's organization's own fund. You might have some unrestricted funding to use as a match. You might get cash donations from outside of your organization, and it could include a project partner or other entities in your community that would like to support the effort by providing cash matches. And also, it could come from other non-federal grants. And I think certainly if you are receiving state grants or other private grants, it's something that you'll want to contact those agencies just to confirm, but generally speaking, that is acceptable. Other potential sources include general revenue, fundraising. If your organization is doing development and fundraising activities, those funds can be used. I do want to just present a caveat that grant funds themselves cannot be used for fundraising activities, but if you have dollars brought in for that purpose, they can be used as a match, as well as other cash donations, partnerships, private foundations could be a good source, and again, other non-federal grants. So if we could go to the next slide. Now, in-kind contribution, this also is allowable under human trafficking grants as a match. And as you can see, it's considered a soft match. So essentially it's a non-cash contribution, and it can come from a variety of sources. It can come but basically it's derived from the monetary value of non-cash contributions that support the work of under the grant. Sometimes that's personnel, salaries, sometimes that's goods or equipment or services that could include direct or indirect costs. One of the things that I wanted to mention here, kind of thinking about in-kind contributions, is that, again, they can come in a variety of forms, but we want to focus on some of the potential sources, which include, again, any partner organizations that you're working with. If they have staff that they are willing to contribute to the project, that's something that would qualify. If they have volunteers that they want to contribute, or your own organization has volunteer services, that can be considered as an in-kind contribution. Donated office or meeting space, these are all really good ways to provide in-kind contributions. Again, it could be from grantee services, it could be from partner services, donated travel expenses, or other donated goods as well. So there's a variety of ways that you can provide in-kind match to meet the requirements. But documenting the match is something that's going to be very important. So that's where I want to spend a little bit more time. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. Here, as you see, we've laid out kind of three main areas in terms of documenting and maintaining records when it comes to your federal match requirement. Of course, the source of that match is very important, whether it's cash or in kind. It's important to be able to document where that's coming from and keep records of that in case you're audited at some point. It's not something that you need to provide directly to OVC at this time, but it's something that you do have to maintain records around. The amount or value of the match, also very, very important. In this way, I think there are several different ways to be able to provide that valuation. And just a couple of examples, looking at valuation of donated services. For an example, if you've got volunteer services that are being funded by a third party, whether they're professional or technical personnel or consultants, they may be counted as a match, but it's really important that the value of those services are consistent with the rates that you might ordinarily pay for similar work, and that you're able to document that and maintain that in your records. Another example would be looking at the value of donated supplies, equipment, or space. And again, it must be comparable to and not exceed the fair market value for those items at the time of the donation, and it's really important that that's documented and kept in your records. And then third, timing. And I think this is a really big issue, particularly now because of the COVID-19 situation, and we're hearing about cash funding and even in-kind contributions that are starting to shrink. So the important thing that I want to mention here is that the match contributions, that requirement has to be met by the time of the end of the grant. It's not necessary that you have to meet the match contribution every month or every quarter. Essentially, it's looking at holistically. What we recently learned is through a survey that was conducted by the National Center for Victims of Crime for the OVC Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center, is that many organizations are seeing a significant decline in these kinds of services, both cash or in kind, that they would use as match. And so I really want to encourage those of you who might find yourself in that place, one, to think about if the match pool is shrinking right now, look at ways that in a few months from now, you can start to build that up again. And you also might want to look retroactively. Maybe there was some potential match that you had in your organization that actually could have been used and was in fact used to support the project, but wasn't tracked or documented that way. That's something that you might want to consider being able to identify as match. And with any of that, I would say, again, kind of there are creative ways. We'll talk about that a little bit more later in this in the webinar. So if we could go to the next slide. Thank you. Lastly, I just want to focus on a couple strategies that we're putting out there for documenting the in-kind match. And again, I kind of touched on this, but the importance of really establishing a rate. If you've got volunteer services, establish a rate within your organization, even develop a policy around it so you can document that. So where you're bringing volunteers in, you've got something to show how you've come up with that amount. Again, look for the replacement value of donated equipment and supplies at the point that you purchase them. Find out what those replacement values are, and that can be used as documentation to support that in-kind match. Looking at pay records, if you've got employees who you're assigning to a grant project and they're not directly funded under the grant, they too can be used as an in-kind match. So you want to look at what their salary is, how much time they're allocating to the project, and to be able to document that. And again, here we're talking about also looking at rental costs. If there's any rental costs that you're donating for use of the project, that too is something that you can pull up the value information and include that in your documentation. And so I just want to leave you with one thought before I turn it over, and that is, we know that it's a challenging time right now, and to the extent that you might have to make some changes in your match requirement in order to meet that, or if you're an applicant, or particularly if you need to make, and you're an existing grantee, I would encourage you to reach out to your program manager just to talk through any changes that you may want to make and document those so that everything will be documented and ultimately allowable in the grant going forward. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Susan. I just want to remind everyone that if you do have a question during today's webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A feature that you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get the answers to those questions sent out in an FAQ document post the webinar today. Okay, well, thanks again, Susan. Next, I'll turn it over to Abbi Horsell.
Hi everyone, my name is Abbi Horsell and I am part of the contractor team that supports the OVC Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center, which is a coaching and development hub charged with strengthening the nation's capacity to assist all victims of human trafficking. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk with you today. So now that Susan has provided a great overview of Match and how to document it, I want to talk about meeting Match in the environment where we now find ourselves working remotely, and maybe experiencing a reduced community capacity to support our efforts. So over the next 15 minutes or so, I hope to share some new practical ideas for you to consider to meet your federal match. Now, I'm not an expert, I don't have all the answers, and I'm navigating these circumstances for the first time just like you are. But I've done a lot of direct work with organizations through my role with the center, and I recognize that each organization approaches Match differently. So not all the ideas that we discussed today are going to work for you, but I hope that we can also do some brainstorming to get some ideas that really well. So before we jump in, I'm hoping that we can all agree to sort of a general approach to ground our discussion, which I'm sure you'll hear my colleagues echo throughout this webinar today. So first, let's think positively. I think there really are some upsides that come with working remotely. Maybe you find yourself with some extra time on your hands, or maybe you like sitting in your pajamas all day. I know I do, but you can't tell because I put on a nice shirt for our webinar this afternoon. But let's lean into the good things that we're finding and see how we can leverage them to meet our match. Let's also think creatively. I'm going to share some ideas and examples from other experiences and from other completely different industries. We're navigating truly unprecedented times, so we have to really think outside of the box and draw on what we can in order to come up with new match ideas. Let's also make sure we're adhering to federal regulations, because regardless of how creative an idea might be, it has to be allowable and it has to be well documented. So please refer back to the guidance that Susan provided on documenting a match, because it will still apply to everything that I share today. At the end of the webinar, we'll also provide some additional resources where you can take a deeper dive into match requirements. And finally, let's think about adapting our strategy. So you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel here and come up with a completely new approach to match. I think we can all think about what we're already doing to meet match and see how we can translate it to our new work environment. So with our positive, creative, compliant, and adaptable approach in mind, we're going to talk more specifically about 4 sources of InKind Match that you're probably already using: volunteers, pro bono services, donations, and personal assets. So let's jump into the next slide and talk about volunteers. In a previous role, I managed an internship program, and we really depended on our volunteers for fundraising, social media, research, and even our IT needs. Our office was located in Alexandria, Virginia, which is about 10 miles outside of Washington, D.C., but it's easily accessible by metro. One summer, our transit authorities shut down about 6 stations on our metro line for extended repair work, and then all of a sudden my interns couldn't get to the office. I totally panicked. I pictured a bunch of interns hanging out in their dorms instead of doing the work that we so desperately needed from them, and I had no idea how I could be responsible or accountable to the universities for the work hours that they were counting towards academic credit. But I ended up being so pleasantly surprised that the interns really thrived with the flexibility and freedom to work a little bit more independently. They turned in high quality work and worked with me to come up with systems to be accountable for their time. So all this is to say that it is absolutely possible to have interns and volunteers who work remotely. Maybe some of your current volunteers can carry on their work on a remote basis, but if not, we've listed a number of ideas on this slide for tasks that volunteers could tackle remotely. Any remote volunteer hours can count towards a federal match. Now, if those projects aren't speaking to you, we can take a step back and talk about some more general ways that you can think about using your volunteers. So I've come up with 4 kind of points that we can think through together today. So first, review your wish list. Do you have any items that kind of perpetually fall to the bottom of your to-do list? Or if you don't have anything that formal, are there things that you think about in the back of your mind that you'd love to do if only you had the time? I know I definitely have one of those lists, and one of the things that's perpetually on there is organizing my files, coming up with consistent names and getting the documents into folders. So is this something a volunteer could do for you on a shared drive? Or if you don't have a shared drive already, could a volunteer set one up for you? That's a great way to support remote work. And then there might be some other things that volunteers could do to help you and your organization transition. The other item on my to-do list is training. I always wish I had more time to keep current with the latest research and trends in the anti-trafficking field. I keep a running list of books that I want to read and recorded webinars that I hope to watch but never end up getting to. So if this is something you have, could a volunteer review it and summarize for you or point you to the best ones? Now that's just a couple of items on my wish list, but what about yours? Could a volunteer help with any of those items? Second, let's think about your grant activities that a volunteer could support. If you're not sure where to start, there are bulleted lists if you refer back to your solicitation. Have you developed your policies and procedures yet? Can a volunteer help with outreach and training? Maybe someone could develop an HT 101 presentation to offer via webinar. Can a volunteer help with some data cleanup, or even take it a step further and do some data analysis for you? Third, think about some of the special skills that your volunteers have. Maybe one of them has some experience in data analysis, like I just mentioned, or maybe they're really good at other things like social media, technology, graphic design, writing, the list goes on and on. So think about how you can use some of those skills. What projects could they support knowing they have that skill set? And lastly, think about recruiting new volunteers. We talked about people maybe having some more free time on their hand as a result of all that's going on. So are there students in your area or people in your network who may want to volunteer at this time? Do they have any special skills? Can they help with any of your grant activities or wish list projects? I know I just asked you about 100 questions, but the idea is that I hope they help you brainstorm and show that volunteers, even when working remotely, can provide an organization with valuable service. As long as you're maintaining records that clearly demonstrate the source, amount, and timing of each remote volunteer service, they're a great way to meet your requirement. One other great thing that volunteers could do is take the new OVC Training and Technical Assistance Center Understanding Human Trafficking training. A great way to get some donated professional development hours and provide a good foundational understanding of human trafficking. One of my colleagues will throw that link up in the chat for you. So let's jump to the next slide and talk a little bit about pro bono services. I'm going to start you off with another story. I'm a huge dog lover, and I volunteer with a local rescue organization. My rescue has a partnership with a dog training center, and normally we offer one free training session per month for all new adopters, which quite frankly isn't enough, but that's all we can negotiate because dog training is really expensive. Basic obedience training can be anywhere from $50 to $75 per session, and you may be looking at 6 to 10 weeks of classes. But now that we can no longer offer those in-person classes, dog trainers seem to be coming out of the woodwork to offer free or low-cost sessions via webinar. Just this week, I've seen a $10 puppy manners class, a $5 session on leash reactivity, and a free daily training exercise. So what I take away from all of this is a couple of things. So first, some people may have some free time right now, but they're willing to offer their services. And some of those people may be willing to offer those services remotely for a free or lower cost than they normally would offer in person. Now, of course, you won't be getting dog trainers, but many professions offer pro bono or subsidized services that can help meet client needs and support your program and organization. On the slide, we've listed a number of providers who you may want to think about asking to provide remote services. If none of those ideas are resonating with you, think back to how we brainstorm potential tasks for volunteers, because the same applies here. You can draw from your wish list or your required grant activities. You can think about what services your clients may need and what services your organization may need, and who may be willing and able to provide them remotely. One great thing about many of the listed pro bono services is their value. Remember that you can use rates that are consistent with market rates for similar work, which Susan spoke to a little bit earlier. So pro bono or even subsidized legal and medical services, for example, where the providers tend to bill at a relatively high rate, will add up really quickly and be a really effective way to help you meet match even in this remote environment. Let's go ahead and move to the next slide. As you all know, donated goods that are necessary and reasonable to accomplish program objectives can count towards your federal match. I'm going to tell one more story and pull an example from another industry, but there's a great little wine shop in my neighborhood, and they've remained open during the pandemic, but started pivoting their operations a few weeks ago. So instead of having people come to the shop, they asked people to ring their doorbell, which I didn't even know they had. And for every bottle of wine you buy, they also give you one free roll of toilet paper. I think it's totally genius. I never thought about how perfectly a roll of toilet paper fits on the neck of a bottle of wine. And they started doing this right as people began stockpiling supplies. So it kind of almost went viral in our community. And everyone who couldn't find toilet paper was going to the wine store where they had plenty because they weren't letting customers into the store to use their bathrooms. So I really love this creative approach, and I think we can definitely learn from it here. So the goods needed in our current environment and how they're delivered will most likely be really different than a typical office environment, and you'll probably need to think differently and creatively in order to use donated goods to meet match at this time. So let's talk a little bit more about new donations and new processes for getting them. So in terms of new goods, are there new items that you can request for your clients or for your staff? I'm thinking about protective gear like gloves and masks, cleaning products, personal hygiene products like soap and hand sanitizer, food, especially for our clients who are out of work or minors that are no longer able to access school lunch programs, and technology to support your staff that are remotely working or your clients who might not have the technical resources like a webcam or smartphone to receive services remotely and keep in touch with their case managers. Now, in terms of new processes, I see two potential options here. So first is thinking about drop-off. If you have staff still at your office or shelter and are still able to accept in-person donations, think about setting up some procedures for either kind of a curbside or no contact drop-off, or even doing some no contact donation pickups. Here's where I think you might be able to learn from how restaurants are handling takeout and food delivery and apply some of the same principles. The other option is also electronic processes and thinking about ways to accept donations virtually. You have an Amazon wish list or maybe some other type of registry where people can order items to be shipped directly to your organization. If not, is this something that perhaps a volunteer can help you set up and maintain? Or can you solicit and accept electronic gift cards? I saw a really great example of this week on my Nextdoor app, which is a social networking app focused on neighborhoods, and something I think a lot of people are turning to right now to make connections with their neighbors and get information. Someone on my app posted from an emergency domestic violence shelter in the community and asked for items from their Amazon wish list, and then specifically diapers, wipes, and any homemade masks. She offered to do shipping, drop off, pickup, any way she could get the items. And she got over 77 responses, which I thought was fantastic. And I think I'm willing to bet many of those donators hadn't even heard of the organization before her post. So with that in mind, I think that new goods and new processes can also bring new donors. So think about potential partners who may be willing to donate the items that you now need. How about a store or restaurant with a surplus of toilet paper? Or maybe they have some other items that you need that they're not using right now. What about a company to help with some of your technology needs? Or what about a crafty volunteer who can make and donate some of these items? Now, as you're changing your procedures and requesting new items, it's important to inform donors, new and old, proactively informing an organization's donors on how to continue their generosity during remote service delivery helps ensure that the donations are both useful and necessary. And of course, making sure that you can maintain normal procedures to record the sources, amount, and timing of the donations will help you meet match during this challenging time. So let's go ahead and jump to the last slide here, which focuses on personal assets. As you heard Susan mention, our partners at the National Center for Victims of Crime recently gathered some data from their crime victims community to assess the needs and readiness of victim service providers to continue providing services during the pandemic. In a live poll, 81% of respondents said that their organizations are performing the majority of their work remotely, which is a lot and a great way to stay safe and healthy at this time. But in a survey that NCVC conducted the week before the poll, only 52% of respondents indicated that their organizations were prepared to maintain operations during the pandemic. Now, I'm making a lot of inferences here, and this is a bit of a stretch, but one thing the survey results kind of point me to is that perhaps not many people were performing their work remotely before the pandemic, and not many organizations offer the tools and resources to support telework. So with that in mind, if you are using a personal cell phone and or a personal laptop, tablet, or some kind of computer to support remote work, and that's probably your cell data and your Wi-Fi network, you could use those personal assets to meet match. So similarly, if you're personally paying for a teleconference or video conference service like Zoom or Skype for Business, and using that account for work or sharing that account information with your colleagues, again, you could use that to meet match. Now, please think back to the guidance that Susan shared on documenting a match, because this will be one of the most challenging sources to document. You'll need to calculate the portion used for business rather than personal use, and do some number crunching to determine the value of that portion.
Next, we'll go to our Q&A portion that we had planned for today's webinar. But before we do that, we have a second poll for you all to complete. So I invite you now to take a few seconds to complete our second set of questions that we have for you all, asking you to tell us a little bit about you and your organization's ability to deliver services remotely during the COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you for your input there and taking some of your time to answer the questions. So now we'll begin the Q&A session of today's webinar. I'll read the questions that have been submitted through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I'll ask a panelist to answer. So some of the questions were received from attendees prior to this meeting. As a reminder to the panelists, just to please unmute your audio and your video if you are asked a question or would like to contribute information. So for the participants, I encourage you to continue to use the Q&A feature during this time. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can with the time that we have remaining, and any unanswered questions will be included in the FAQ document that will be emailed to you after today's webinar. So our first question that we have, Kristen, this is going to go to you. So the question is, are there any circumstances in which OVC can entertain a waiver of the match, even if for a temporary period of time? Kristen, I can't hear your audio, maybe.
I'm sorry.
There you go.
I got one mute and not the other mute. Thank you, Lauren. Yeah, I believe this was mentioned a little bit at the beginning, but I know some folks joined late. So just to let folks know, by law, all OVC human trafficking grants require a 25% match. Again, that's specific to the OVC human trafficking funds. That is within our statute that requires match. So because it is law, OVC has no authority to issue a waiver. The only way to change the match requirement is to have Congress actually change the legislation. So please note that the match requirement may be different, though, for other OVC solicitations. Again, the 25% match is specific to the human trafficking awards. We do have other discretionary programs that do not require match. So it's very important to read each solicitation very much in detail. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. And we will also stay with you for our next question. So our next question is, if our volunteer program does not have a structure where remote work is possible, and we have to shut down our program due to COVID-19, can we substitute other costs to meet our matching requirements? Do we need to do an amendment to the grant to make that change possible?
So I'll answer this, and then I know I have some other OVC colleagues on the line. So if they want to chime in, just let us know in the chat so we know to unmute you. But essentially, I'm assuming you have an OVC grant currently. So if that is the case, you do have the ability to change your match down the line. So if, for instance, you have all of your match in personnel and clearly you have had to close down, so you're not operating right now, but maybe you're not optimistic that you'll be able to make that match and you want to change it to something else, that can be done. Talk to your grant manager. Depending upon the parameters, it may require a grant adjustment notice and a budget modification. Your grant manager will talk through the parameters around that specifically. Oh, and I had another thought and it just went out of my head. So I'm just checking the chat to see if my colleagues want to chime in on anything else regarding that. Oh, the other thing to keep in mind, I remembered, is you don't have to meet your match all within the same period parallel to your federal funding. So even though we're in a time right now where you may not be operating, we do have grantees where there might be a spell where they're not accruing or reporting match, but then in the next quarter or the next 6 months, they make up for that match. So basically, what you need to keep in mind is that you meet your federal match requirement by the end of the award period. You don't have to do it, evenly throughout the award period.
Thanks, Kristen. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And Susan, I'll turn this question over to you. Pre-COVID-19, we had a large fundraising event. While we used the proceeds as a cash match, it was a volunteer-run event. Can I apply those volunteer hours to match?
And the question is specifically volunteer hours to the fundraising activity?
Yeah, I believe so. That's how I'm interpreting it.
I may want Kristen to confer on this, but my understanding is because a match has to be used for a purpose that would be allowable under a grant. And since you can't fundraise under a grant, I don't believe that you would be able to actually apply that volunteer's time in the fundraising effort as a match. But perhaps Kristen might have more to say on that, but that would be my understanding. In that circumstance, it probably would not meet the match requirement. Kristen, I see her.
Yeah. Yes, I think basically match funds hold the same parameters as federal funds. So what is allowable under your federal funds is then allowable under your match, but what is not allowable under federal funds, is not allowable under your match funds. So Susan's example was spot on.
Great. And if I might add just a follow up to the last question that Kristen addressed on the waiver of a match requirement. And I know certainly, as Kristen said, it's not something that can be done under the human trafficking program. That is statutory and it doesn't allow for it. But just so if there are people on the webinar who may have other federal funds that have a match requirement, that may not be the case. I know there are VAWA funds that require a match, and sometimes there are provisions for waivers. So if you have other federal funding and that's an issue for you, I would say contact your grantor agency and ask them about it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Kristen and Susan. So just a few closing remarks on my end. I want to thank everyone for your questions and the discussion today. The National Center for Victims of Crime has created a Facebook group for crime victims community in COVID-19. There are currently over 500 members sharing ideas and talking about how they are working during this unprecedented time. A link to that group will be posted in the chat feature, so you can reference that. If you do have any specific questions on how to meet your match requirement, please direct those to your grant monitor because each grant has different requirements. If you have general questions on the match requirement, you can email the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center, and that email address to how to reach the center is also located in the chat. So I'll turn my time over to Kristen Weschler with the Office for Victims of Crime for our closing remarks. Kristen, over to you.
Yep, just pushing all the buttons. Thank you, Lauren. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I know some of this was late notice, but we were very anxious to get this material out to you, given that it is grant application season. So this has been a great discussion. Your thoughtful questions were really appreciated. And we hope the answers provided gave you the information you needed to move forward and effectively address your federal match. We encourage you to contact your grant manager, as Lauren suggested, with questions about your specific grant. If you're a current grantee, they know your grant based on what year it was funded, what solicitation it's funded under. All of those make a difference. And your grant monitor or manager is really your best source of knowledge. So the Capacity Building Center team, also as Lauren mentioned, is also available to support you. Please contact them via email, which was provided on the slide and in the chat, which is contact@ovc-htcbc.org, and they'll follow up with you. They're a great team. You may also contact, again, your OVC grant manager for questions about your grant. Thank you again for your time. We look forward to reconnecting with each of you in the upcoming weeks through video chats, further webinars, and timely content. OVC is committed to assisting you in fulfilling your responsibilities of serving victims of crime in your community. Thanks so much. Stay safe and reach out to us. We're happy to help.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristen. Thanks to all of our presenters today and to everyone participating in today's webinar. This now concludes today's webinar. Thank you, everyone, again, and have a great rest of your day.